Abstraction and Illumination, as presented by St. Thomas Aquinas. Epistemology is in the habit of asking some very complicated questions. Since epistemology is the study of how we as humans know, some of the questions asked are like this. How do we know? Can we really know something or someone? What is true knowledge? How do we know we are not simply seeing an artificially generated reality and we are actually a brain in a vat? In this short presentation, we will not have time to answer many of these questions, but I will take a few moments to present a portion of the epistemology of St. Thomas Aquinas. We will focus on his idea of abstraction, or illumination. Aquinas' basic idea about knowing the material world is that our human intellect can abstract the form of an object and bring it within itself in order to know it. However, a philosophy professor at the University of Colorado by the name of Robert Pasnow points out, Aquinas believes that the ultimate goal of intellectual abstraction is to arrive at the substantial form, but that more often we arrive at one or another accidental form. This means that Aquinas believes that most often we do not arrive at true knowledge of something, but we can grasp something that is true about the object in question. Therefore, this presentation will look at the process of abstraction and its benefits to the study of epistemology. Before we dive into Aquinas' epistemology, it would be good to remind ourselves of where epistemology started and how it grew into the Thomistic thought. Initially, there were the pre-Socratics. Heraclitus thought that reality was in a state of flux and was constantly changing. It would be really hard to know anything with this philosophy because everything is always in motion of some sort. Parmenides claimed that change is an illusion and everything is actually one and the same. Change only exists in our perception of reality, but everything is simply existing. Next came Plato, who came up with his theory of forms. I find that this is best explained through the explanation of Plato's allegory of the cave. Here is a short video explaining the allegory of the cave.
What is reality? Knowledge? The meaning of life? Big topics you might tackle figuratively, explaining existence as a journey down a road or across an ocean, a climb, a war, a book, a thread, a game, a window of opportunity, or an all too short-lived flicker of flame. 2,400 years ago, one of history's most famous thinkers said life is like being chained up in a cave, forced to watch shadows flitting across a stone wall. Pretty cheery, right? That's actually what Plato suggested in his Allegory of the Cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic, in which the Greek philosopher envisioned the ideal society by examining concepts like justice, truth, and beauty. In the allegory, a group of prisoners have been confined in a cavern since birth with no knowledge of the outside world. They are chained facing a wall, unable to turn their heads, while a fire behind them gives off a faint light. Occasionally, people pass by the fire carrying figures of animals and other objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners name and classify these illusions, believing they're perceiving actual entities. Suddenly, one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time. The sunlight hurts his eyes, and he finds the new environment disorienting. When told that the things around him are real, while the shadows were mere reflections, he cannot believe it. The shadows appeared much clearer to him, but gradually his eyes adjust until he can look at reflections in the water, at objects directly, and finally at the sun, whose light is the ultimate source of everything he has seen. The prisoner returns to the cave to share his discovery, but he is no longer used to the darkness and has a hard time seeing the shadows on the wall. The other prisoners think the journey has made him stupid and blind, and violently resist any attempts to free them. Plato introduces this passage as an analogy of what it's like to be a philosopher trying to educate the public. Most people are not just comfortable in their ignorance, but hostile to anyone who points it out. In fact, the real-life Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenian government for disrupting the social order, and his student Plato spends much of the Republic disparaging Athenian democracy, while promoting rule by philosopher kings. With the cave parable, Plato may be arguing that the masses are too stubborn and ignorant to govern themselves. But the allegory has captured imaginations for 2,400 years because it can be read in far more ways. Importantly, the allegory is connected to the theory of forms developed in Plato's other dialogues, which holds that, like the shadows on the wall, things in the physical world are flawed reflections of ideal forms, such as roundness or beauty. In this way, the cave leads to many fundamental questions, including the origin of knowledge, the problem of representation, and the nature of reality itself. For theologians, the ideal forms exist in the mind of a creator. For philosophers of language viewing the forms as linguistic concepts, the theory illustrates the problem of grouping concrete things under abstract terms. And others still wonder whether we can really know that the things outside the cave are any more real than the shadows. As we go about our lives, can we be confident in what we think we know? Perhaps one day a glimmer of light may punch a hole in your most basic assumptions. Will you break free to struggle towards the light, even if it costs you your friends and family? Or stick with comfortable and familiar illusions? Truth or habit? Light or shadow? Hard choices, but if it's any consolation, you're not alone. There are lots of us down here.
The most important part of this video for our study was the mentioning of the theory of forms. It spoke on how Plato thought that the material world was made up of images or reflections of universal ideals that were unachievable. The meaning of existence was to grow toward the universal form. For instance, a tree is growing to match the form of a universal tree. The universal ideal of a tree. Plato's philosophy was that the universals were the true reality and that material world was just reflections and images. Aristotle has the opposite line of thought, which is the line of thought that St. Thomas follows and develops. Aristotle's philosophy was that the material world was the true reality and that the universals are concepts that we can discover to come to a greater understanding of the material world. To help, here is a quote from Mark Gasser-Wingate, a philosophy professor at Boston University, about Aristotle's epistemology. He says, Aristotle tells us that we learn things in three ways. We perceive particulars, we come to grasp universals by induction from these perceived particulars, and eventually we find ourselves in a position to demonstrate things about the universals we came to grasp inductively. St. Thomas Aquinas takes this idea and develops it into abstraction, or illumination. Abstraction or illumination seems to center on the intellect of the human soul, but instead, this process has everything to do with the species, or form of objects in the world. The species is the connecting bridge between the human intellect and the actual object in the world. Abstraction, or illumination, is the process that builds the bridge. We must start by remembering that the species of a certain object, also known as the form of the object, is what is giving the object intelligible structure. The form is what is informing the matter to be the way that it is. Remember that most philosophers speak of something called prime matter. This is a matter that does not have a form to it. Technically, it does not exist because all matter that exists already has some type of form. Instead, prime matter is an idea that helps us as philosophers to visualize and understand the material world. There is an event of actualization between prime matter and form in an object before a human mind is even involved. The form limits the prime matter and sets it apart from all other matter. However, this form, or species, can also inform other matter, making objects into objects of the same species, objects that are like each other. For example, all trees are distinct from each other, but are being informed by the same form. Therefore, they are all part of the same species, which is why we can group them into a category that we call trees. This is the same for any object in nature or man-made. Before we look at the abstraction of the species, we must now realize that the human soul has both an active intellect and a passive intellect. In other words, the intellect has act and potency within itself. When the intellect has potency, this means that the intellect has the ability to know something, but it does not yet know this thing. The intellect may not always have the ability to know something. For instance, the intellect must be exposed by way of the senses to the qualities and characteristics of an object in the world before it can know this object. However, once the qualities and characteristics are observed, the intellect has the potential to know this object, but has not yet been illuminated to its species or form. The active intellect is when the intellect is informed by the species of the object and connects the qualities and characteristics with the form of the object, gaining the ability to recreate or represent the object. This is the process of abstraction. Many times, when a mind performs the process of abstraction, they will express something along the lines of, "Oh, that's what that's for," and the mind then knows the object.